Hello, in this video we are going to be looking at moral realism. And there are two forms of moral realism that you need to know about on the specification. One is naturalism, which is the topic for this video, and the other is non-naturalism, which we look at in a subsequent video. All right. So, naturalism and non-naturalism. Any naturalistic moral theories are a form of realism, okay? And as such, if you're a moral realist and a naturalist, you will believe that there are moral facts, that certain things are morally right, and that's a fact, and certain things are morally wrong, and that's a fact. Now, for a naturalist in particular, truth and falsity are thought to relate to some kind of scientific progress, usually human psychology, and within the realm of philosophy that tends towards ideas surrounding utilitarianism, but I will move on to that in a moment. So realists believe that moral judgments are cognitive, right? And that's something that is true of both naturalists and non-naturalists. And again, that is something I'll talk about a little later. A non-naturalistic moral theory is one that is not reduced to any natural science, but still holds that there is truth and falsity in ethics. So again, it is still cognitive and it is still a realist theory. And that obviously is something that I'll look at in much more detail in the video on non-naturalism. All right. Christian ethics, however, can be thought of as a form of non-naturalism because although you have moral absolutes in Christianity, it's not something that can be investigated by science. All right. And similarly, as I say, we'll see in the next video, G.E. Moore's non-naturalistic intuitionism does not require any scientific investigation either. But as I say, I'm not going to talk too much about that now because our task here is to focus on naturalism. All right. So as I said just now, naturalism is the view that morality is somehow answerable or reducible to scientific progress, and because of that, it contains moral truths, things that are right, are factual, and things that are wrong are factual. And for that reason, as I say, it is also a cognitive theory. All right. So moral judgments can be usually reduced to a form of natural science, usually psychology, and of course, as psychology progresses, the thought goes, we gradually sort of intuit these moral truths more and more directly. All right. As our understanding of psychology becomes more sophisticated, so will our understanding of moral judgment. And some naturalists draw a parallel with the idea that as we become sort of more scientifically aware, as science advances, so we become more morally aware too. All right. Within philosophy specifically, or within the specification, naturalism is associated with versions of utilitarianism and virtue ethics. And the reason for that is that you can argue that utilitarianism is a naturalistic theory since human beings desire pleasure and happiness, certainly according to John Stuart Mill's proof, which I'll brush on shortly. And so through this, one can say that there is an element of moral truth somewhere within human psychology. All right. So our moral worth is kind of determined through our desire for happiness, and our desire for happiness is something that is ingrained in human beings. So therefore, this is a kind of moral theory that does actually relate to something natural within us, hence naturalism. All right. But here's an important question that you have to sort of tackle in relation to naturalism. Is ethics an area of thought with its own laws and principles, and that is answerable to a form of science such as psychology or evolutionary theory? In other words, just as science has its own principles, does ethics have its own principles as well that, like scientific ones, are discoverable? All right, and if they are discoverable, and the answer is yes to that, then of course you can say that you've discovered some moral facts. All right. So as I say, it's a fundamental meta-ethical question, but it does seem quite difficult to answer, or even to know how to answer it. And this is something that I will explore now with reference to various versions of utilitarianism. Before that, however, if we are going to talk in sort of naturalistic terms, then obviously factoring evolution into that is important, or could be important. And you might argue that evolution is itself responsible for our moral behaviour, because we are evolved animals, and as evolved animals we have certain behaviour that goes along with that, so we can say quite easily that our behaviour is an evolved characteristic, in the same way that, you know, lions and tigers and elephants have behaviour that is an evolved characteristic of lions, tigers and elephants. So human beings also have or also behave in particular ways that are answerable to the way that they have evolved. All right. So then, within this naturalistic idea, you've also then got the question that if something seems morally right to you, does it make it evolutionarily advantageous? Now, of course, one might say, well, yes, you know, morality is a construction that has evolved in human beings because we've discovered that adapting to working in teams and collectively makes us more evolutionarily superior, if you like, to other animals. But by the same token, you can't always, I suppose, think that just because something seems right to us, it will in the end be something that shows as an evolutionary advantage. Right? That's something that in any particular moment it's not possible to answer. So we're going to look at a naturalist intuitionist solution. All right. Now, Henry Sidgwick, in his book The Methods of Ethics, puts this forward. Now, Sidgwick is not actually in the specification, but he is a utilitarian. All right. And in his book The Methods of Ethics, he was trying to get over some of the inconsistencies that he could see in Bentham and Mill's versions of it. All right, and he was a little bit more meta-ethical in his approach as a result. Okay, but of course you are perfectly entitled to mention Mill and Bentham. In fact, I would actively encourage it in terms of the specification and naturalism. All right, so I will talk about that as well. But I will look at Sidgwick, because Sidgwick can give us some clarity here. All right, so Sidgwick believed that he could find a solution to arbitrary realism in the form of a naturalist intuitionism. Now, what do I mean by arbitrary realism? Basically the idea that moral judgments are essentially down to our emotional responses. So if you think about emotivism typifying that idea. All right. And so, of course, it's arbitrary because our moral judgment really just depend on how we feel at any given time, or how society has chosen to respond to itself and that which exists outside of it. All right. So Sidgwick is trying to sort of say, look, there is something more to morality than this. Okay. And he says that we do intuit these moral truths. But then he sort of firms up on this, and he says that these intuitions are essentially based on three principles: the principle of prudence, the principle of justice, and the principle of benevolence. And these three principles are essentially answerable to various sort of naturalistic intuitions that we have concerning our long-term happiness or our long-term pleasure. Hence, they are, at a fundamental level, utilitarian. All right, but they also exist within our sort of evolved psychology, and so we can say that they are a form of naturalism. All right. So the principle of prudence essentially says that we prefer the greater good in the long term. All right, and that's rather similar to John Stuart Mill's rule utilitarianism. All right, so we always strive to make the future better than the past. And you could also make a link here with Aristotelian virtue ethics. You know, Aristotle's starting point saying nobody wishes for a life that is futile. Everyone wants to make their life better, even if sometimes they are mistaken in the methods that they choose in order to do that. All right. So there are links here between John Stuart Mill's utilitarianism and also Aristotle's virtue ethics. All right. So this idea that we want the greater good in the long term informs our moral intuition. All right. So sometimes it'll just be a sort of way that it directs us, but a lot of the time we actually do sort of think about, we calculate what will happen in the future, and from that determine which actions are going to cause our greater good in the long term. All right. Now this is closely linked with the principle of justice, which is essentially empathetic. So there's the idea, how would others feel if we acted in certain ways? Well, we've all encountered those times when someone has said, imagine if somebody did that to you, how would you like it? Right? So because of that sense of empathy, we also have this idea, this also informs our moral sense, both in terms of individual actions and also the long-term good. All right? Because if we all treat each other in a better way, if we're all empathetic towards one another, that will then in turn create a longer-term good. All right? And as a result of these first two principles, the principle of prudence and the principle of justice, we can arrive at the principle of benevolence. All right? So we should regard the good of others as much as we do the good of ourselves. Okay? And so, as you can see, this is quite close to utilitarianism of the kind that Mill put forward, rule utilitarianism, that is. And you can also think, I think, of Sidgwick's three principles as, if you like, moral truths according to a naturalist, right? A naturalist realist. So Mill obviously tries to show that utilitarianism is true through his notorious proof. All right, and it runs basically like this: if one says something is visible, we can say so on the grounds of what can be seen. Similarly, if one says something is desirable, one can say so on the grounds that people desire it. Therefore, if happiness is the ultimate human goal and as such what people desire most, then it must be the case, i.e. proved, that utilitarianism is the principal moral doctrine. Now, if you accept that proof, and you are also accepting of Henry Sidgwick's three principles, then perhaps you are a moral naturalist and you believe that there are certain moral truths that are bound up within all this that we can consider to be moral facts. So has Sidgwick solved the problem of arbitrary realism? Well, there is the problem of showing how naturalist intuitions are objectively right in terms of being cognitive. All right? So even if we accept that there is something within us that has been developed through evolution, right? That we do have these principles inside us, how do we know that whatever they are actually objectively right in terms of guiding us morally? How do we know that what they guide us to do is actually the morally right thing and not something that is purely evolutionarily advantageous, for example? All right. So believing that is a big leap, right? Even if we accept that our moral intuitions are based in utilitarianism. So that's the end of this video. Next video, we are going to be looking at moral realism, but the non-naturalistic version, right? And we're going to take a look at G.E. Moore's intuitionism, his non-naturalistic intuitionism.